Frostbite doesn't announce itself. It creeps in like a quiet thief, numbing the toes, then the fingers, until the very will to survive crystallizes into ice. 16-year-old Harper Delaney learned this clinging to a canvas duffel bag on the shoulder of Highway 93, watching the taillights of her stepfather's Ford F-150 disappear into the freezing November mist. She had $42, a folding knife, her late father's hatchet, and a heavy tarp. Society dictated she was a runaway destined for the system. Reality dictated she was immediate prey to the elements. But the bitter Montana wilderness was about to learn that this discarded teenager was forged from something far harder than the approaching winter. Bitter cold was already biting at the edges of the afternoon when Richard slammed the brakes, sending the truck skidding slightly on the gravel shoulder. The engine idled roughly, a mechanical growl that matched the suffocating tension inside the cab. "Get out." Harper stared straight ahead at the dashboard. She didn't look at Richard Caldwell, her stepfather of 3 years. Nor did she look back at her mother, Evelyn, who was sitting in the middle seat, staring rigidly at her own hands. "I said, get out, Harper. I'm done." "We are done," Richard sneered, leaning over to unlatch her door, shoving it open into the biting wind. "You think you're so tough, constantly challenging me under my own roof. Let's see how tough you are out here. Go find your own roof." The fight had been over something painfully trivial, a missing spark plug from his garage that he blamed her for losing, but it was merely the spark that ignited a powder keg of 3 years of mutual hatred. Harper had finally screamed back, throwing his chronic unemployment and emotional abuse in his face. In response, he had dragged her out by her collar, tossed her father's old camping duffel into the truck bed, forced her mother into the cab to witness the consequences of raising a brat, and driven 40 miles out of Missoula into the deep, unforgiving foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. Harper finally turned her head, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She looked at her mother. "Mom?" Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping, but she didn't speak. She didn't reach out. Her silence was a heavier blow than Richard's physical shove. It was the ultimate betrayal, the severing of the final frayed rope tethering Harper to civilization. Without another word, Harper stepped out into the biting wind, grabbed her olive-green duffel from the truck bed, and watched as Richard slammed the vehicle into gear, kicking up a shower of icy gravel as he sped away. The taillights bled into the grey twilight, leaving behind a silence so absolute it made her ears ring. She was 16. She was completely alone, and the temperature was dropping fast. Panic, hot and suffocating, clawed at her throat. The logical next step for a teenager in this situation was to walk back along the highway, hitch a ride, and find a police station. But Harper knew what awaited her there. She had been in the foster system for 2 years after her father died, before Evelyn had married Richard and regained custody. The group homes had been concrete boxes of despair, filled with predatory older kids and apathetic staff. She would rather freeze than go back into that bureaucratic cage. Looking to the west, the Bitterroot Mountains loomed like jagged teeth against the fading sky. Her biological father, a backcountry guide who had passed away when she was 11, had taught her the woods. He had taught her how to read the moss, how to build a fire in a downpour, and how to disappear. "The forest doesn't care if you're crying, Harpy." His voice echoed in her memory, unbidden but welcome. "It only cares if you're prepared." She hoisted the heavy duffel onto her shoulder and turned her back on the asphalt. She stepped off the embankment and plunged into the dense, darkening tree line. The first night was a brutal test of endurance. Harper hiked for 3 hours, pushing deep into the national forest to ensure Richard hadn't called the county sheriff to pick her up just to teach her a lesson. By nightfall, she found a small depression beneath the sweeping, low-hanging branches of an ancient Douglas fir. The dense needles acted as a natural umbrella against the freezing drizzle that had begun to fall. Her hands were shaking violently as she unzipped the duffel. Inside were the contents she had frantically shoved together when Richard began his rampage. A heavy wool sweater, 3 pairs of thick socks, Her father's sleeping bag rated for 0 degrees, though its insulation was old. A rusted hatchet, a box of waterproof matches, a small first aid kit, a spool of paracord, a metal water bottle, and 4 granola bars. She strung the heavy polyethylene tarp over the lowest branches of the fir, staking it down with sharpened sticks to create a low, wind-blocking wedge. She didn't dare build a fire. The wind was whipping dangerously, and the wet wood would only produce smoke that could draw unwanted attention from a passing ranger. Crawling into the sleeping bag fully clothed, including her boots, Harper curled into a tight fetal position. The cold seeped up from the damp earth, bypassing the thin barrier of the bag. Every muscle in her body shivered uncontrollably. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she forced herself to eat only half of 1 granola bar. She had to ration everything. As the wind howled through the canopy above, sounding like a chorus of screaming ghosts, the reality of her situation crushed her. She wept. She cried for her father. She cried for the mother who had abandoned her, and she cried for the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what lay ahead. But by the time the grey, lifeless dawn broke through the trees, her tears had frozen on her cheeks. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. Survival was no longer an abstract concept. It was her only remaining job. Morning light revealed a world painted in frost. Harper emerged from her tarp cocoon, her joints stiff and aching, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. The temperature was hovering in the low 20s. Winter was not coming. It was already knocking on the door. She needed a permanent location. A temporary lean-to would become a frozen tomb in a matter of weeks. She needed water, building materials, and a natural windbreak. Packing her meager camp, she began to hike deeper into the rugged terrain, avoiding any faint game trails that might double as hunting paths for humans. For hours, she scrambled over moss-slicked boulders and pushed through dense thickets of hawthorn, the thorns tearing at her jeans and scratching her arms. By midday, dehydration and exhaustion were setting in. She paused to drink from her metal water bottle, realizing with a jolt of fear that she only had a few swallows left. Just as despair threatened to overtake her, the faint, rhythmic sound of rushing water drifted through the trees. She pushed forward, breaking through a line of dense alder bushes, and stopped. Before her lay a narrow, deep ravine. A clear, fast-moving creek cut through the center, tumbling over smooth grey river stones. On the far side of the creek, the earth rose sharply into a steep, rocky embankment that formed a natural concave wall, a perfect thermal mass and windbreak. The surrounding area was thick with straight, slender lodgepole pines. It was perfect. It was a fortress. Harper scrambled down the bank, falling to her knees by the freezing water. She drank greedily, the icy liquid shocking her system awake. As she splashed water on her face, she noticed something half buried under a tangle of exposed tree roots on the bank. She walked over and pulled at the decaying roots. A rusty, metal object broke free. It was an old, heavy-duty bow saw, the wooden handle grayed and splintering, the blade oxidized to a dull orange. Near it, half crushed under a rock, was a galvanized steel bucket. It was an old, abandoned trapper's cache, likely untouched for decades. Harper stared at the saw, her heart pounding. The hatchet in her bag was good for delimbing, but felling enough trees to build a cabin with a hand hatchet would have taken a month she didn't have. This rusted piece of metal was a lifeline. The work began immediately. She spent the rest of the day clearing a flat 8 by 8 foot patch of earth against the rock wall. Using a sturdy stick, she dug into the soil, leveling it as best she could. Her hands quickly developed angry red blisters from the friction, which popped and wept fluid, mixing with the dirt. She tore strips from the bottom of her undershirt to wrap around her palms, ignoring the stinging pain. Over the next 5 days, Harper fell into a grueling, rhythmic state of survival. She rationed her remaining granola bars to tiny bites, surviving mostly on the sheer adrenaline of labor. She used the rusty saw to fell dozens of young lodgepole pines, selecting trees that were roughly 6 to 8 inches in diameter. The saw required immense physical exertion. Her shoulders burned, and her back screamed in agony with every pull. Each felled tree had to be dragged back to the site, delimbed with the hatchet, and cut to length. She decided on an interlocking notch system for the corners, a technique she had seen her father use when building a hunting blind. It was sloppy at first. Her notches were uneven, leaving wide, drafty gaps between the logs. But as the walls slowly rose, reaching her knees, then her waist, her technique improved. Hunger became a physical entity, a sharp pain twisting her intestines. On the fourth day, she found a patch of late-season rosehips and a cluster of edible dandelion roots, boiling them in her scavenged steel bucket over a small, carefully managed fire. The resulting broth was bitter and thin, but it warmed her core and provided a desperately needed influx of calories. She also managed to fashion a rudimentary snare from her paracord, catching a small snowshoe hare on the 6th morning. She skinned it with her folding knife, a gruesome task that made her stomach heave, but roasted the meat over the fire until it was charred. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. By the end of the second week, the walls of the cabin were 6 feet high. It was a tiny, claustrophobic box, but it was solid. She packed the deep, uneven gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud, river clay, and dry pine needles, a primitive wattle, and daub that hardened like cement in the freezing air. For the roof, she laid a series of thicker logs across the top, binding them tightly with her remaining paracord. She layered this with a foot of dense pine boughs, packed heavy mud over the branches, and finally stretched her large tarp over the entire structure, tying it down with heavy stones. She stood back, her clothes filthy and torn, her face smeared with soot and mud, and looked at her creation. It wasn't beautiful. It looked like a feral animal's den, but it was hers. That night, she slept inside the cabin. The walls blocked the wind entirely. It was an incredible psychological victory, but as she lay in the pitch black, she could feel the ambient temperature of the room dropping steadily. Her breath still plumed in the dark. The tarp roof held the heat of her small body for a short time, but the walls were cold. When she woke up the next morning, the water in her steel bucket had frozen solid. A heavy, ominous grey ceiling of clouds had rolled in over the mountains. The air smelled of metallic ozone and deep cold. A blizzard was coming. And Harper realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that 4 wooden walls wouldn't save her. If she lit a fire inside the sealed cabin, the smoke would asphyxiate her in minutes. If she didn't light a fire, she would freeze to death in her sleeping bag. She needed a chimney. And she needed it before the snow fell. Building a wooden structure was a matter of brute force and simple geometry. Building a functioning, fire-safe chimney out of raw earth and stone was a matter of engineering, and failure meant death. Harper had a small, rectangular opening left in the wall opposite her sleeping area, originally intended to be a makeshift window. She would have to tear down part of the wall to expand it, creating a hearth that pushed outward, with a chimney extending up the exterior side of the cabin. She sprinted to the creek. The water was agonizingly cold, numbing her hands to the wrists within seconds. She began hauling large, flat river stones up the embankment, stacking them near the cabin. It took 40 trips, her legs trembling under the weight, before she felt she had enough. Next, she needed mortar. The mud she had used for the walls wouldn't withstand the direct heat of a raging fire. It would dry, crack, and crumble, eventually setting the log walls ablaze. She waded farther downstream until she found a thick, grey vein of pure river clay cut into the bank. Using her hands and the hatchet, she gouged out heavy chunks of the dense, sticky material, hauling it back in the metal bucket. The wind began to pick up, howling through the pines and violently shaking the tarp on her roof. The temperature was plummeting, dropping into the teens. Small, hard pellets of ice began to spit from the sky. stinging her face like buckshot. Harper worked frantically. She laid a foundation of flat stones outside the wall opening, building a U-shaped firebox. She slathered thick layers of the grey clay between each stone, pressing them firmly together. Her hands were raw, the cuts on her fingers packed with freezing dirt, but she couldn't stop. As the firebox grew waist-high, she faced the most critical part of the construction, the smoke shelf. She remembered her father explaining the mechanics of their fireplace at home. Hot air rises, Harpy, but cold air drops down the chimney. If you don't build a shelf to catch the cold downdraft and push it back up with the hot air, the smoke just blows straight back into the room. She angled the back wall of the firebox forward slightly as she built upward, creating a narrow throat, then built a flat ledge of stone just behind it. It was a rudimentary design, guessed at from childhood memories, but she prayed it would work. To build the flue, the tall, hollow column that would draw the smoke out, she couldn't rely on stones alone. They were too heavy and unstable, stacked that high without proper cement. Instead, she harvested several long, straight saplings. She lashed them together in a tall, narrow pyramid shape, securing the base around the stone throat of the firebox and leaning the top against the exterior wall of the cabin, extending a foot past the roofline. Then came the mudding. She mixed the river clay with dry grass and water, plunging her bare, freezing arms into the bucket to churn it into a thick paste. She slapped heavy handfuls of the clay onto the sapling frame, building a thick, solid exterior over the wood, smoothing it out to create a sealed pipe. The work was agonizing. The wet clay froze to her skin, and she had to frequently stop to shove her hands into her armpits just to restore enough feeling to keep her fingers moving. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the ice pellets had transitioned into thick, heavy flakes of snow. The wind was a sustained, roaring force, tearing through the ravine. The chimney stood, a strange, lumpy spire of grey earth leaning against the raw timber cabin, but the clay was still wet. If she lit a heavy fire immediately, the rapid expansion of steam within the clay would shatter it, collapsing the entire structure. She crawled into the cabin, pulling a pile of dry twigs and a few small, split logs she had stored inside into the stone hearth. Her hands shook so violently, she dropped her matchbox twice. On the third attempt, she struck a match. The flame flared, a tiny, fragile spark of life in the gloom. She touched it to a handful of dry moss. The moss smouldered, then caught, sending a thin ribbon of grey smoke upward. Harper held her breath, watching the smoke. For a terrifying second, the smoke curled back, drifting heavily into the cabin, stinging her eyes. She coughed, panic seizing her chest. It's failing. It's not drafting. Then, the ambient heat in the narrow throat of the chimney shifted. A sudden, soft whoosh sounded from the stones, and the ribbon of smoke jerked backward, sucking violently up into the dark, clay-lined flue. Harper scrambled backward, watching in awe as the fire grew. She carefully added thicker twigs, then a split piece of pine. The fire crackled, throwing a brilliant, warm, orange glow across the rough-hewn log walls of her tiny sanctuary. The smoke continued to draw perfectly up the chimney, leaving the air inside the cabin completely clear. She had to build the heat slowly to cure the clay, keeping it at a low smolder for hours. As night fell, the blizzard fully descended upon the bitterroots. The wind screamed outside, battering the log walls, and the snow piled rapidly against the exterior. The temperature plummeted past zero, heading toward -20, but inside the 8x8 cabin, Harper Delaney stripped off her freezing wet jacket and hung it on a wooden peg she had hammered into the wall. She sat cross-legged on her father's sleeping bag, holding her scarred, blistered hands out to the dancing flames. The stones of the hearth were radiating a deep, penetrating heat that seeped into her bones, chasing away the deadly chill that had lived inside her for weeks. She listened to the violent storm raging outside, a storm that would have easily killed her just 24 hours ago. She looked at the fire, then up at the sturdy, mud-packed logs she had cut with her own bleeding hands. She was not prey. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. And for the first time since she was 11 years old, Harper felt truly warm. Silence replaced the howling wind. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed against the mud-packed walls of the cabin. When Harper finally stirred, the fire had burned down to a mound of glowing, cherry-red embers, radiating a steady, life-saving heat. She unzipped the sleeping bag, her breath no longer freezing in the air, and crawled toward the entrance. She pushed against the heavy tarp door, but it didn't give. Panic flared briefly before she realized what had happened. She threw her shoulder against it, shoving hard. The tarp gave way, and a wall of blinding, crystalline white collapsed inward. The blizzard had dumped nearly 4 feet of snow overnight, completely burying her small ravine and entombing her cabin. Digging out took 3 exhausting hours. Using her scavenged metal bucket as a makeshift shovel, Harper cleared a trench from her doorway to the edge of the creek, which was now a sluggish, dark ribbon fighting against encroaching shelves of ice. The world had transformed into a sterile, frozen, alien landscape. The temperature hovered around -10 degrees. While her chimney had saved her from freezing in her sleep, the deep snow presented a new, immediate death sentence. Starvation. She could not walk through 4 feet of powder to check her snares or forage. Every step would drain hundreds of calories she simply didn't have. Her stomach contracted painfully. She had eaten nothing but a few roasted roots and water for 2 days. The adrenaline of the blizzard had masked the hunger, but now it roared back with a vengeance. Sitting by the fire, she grabbed her folding knife and the remaining paracord. She needed snowshoes. Recalling a diagram from one of her father's old field manuals, she harvested several pliable willow branches from the creek bank. She bent them into teardrop shapes, lashing the ends tightly together, and then wove a crude web of paracord and strips of denim cut from the hem of her extra jeans across the frames. They were ugly, lopsided things, but when she strapped them to her boots the next morning, they kept her suspended on the crust of the snow. Harper ventured out, moving like a clumsy ghost through the silent pines. She checked the 3 snares she had set before the storm. 2 were buried and empty. The third, set near a cluster of gnawed bark, was sprung, but there was no hair. Approaching the snare, she saw the snow was violently churned. Splatters of bright red blood stained the pristine white, stark and terrifying. The paracord snare line had been snapped, not chewed. Harper dropped to one knee, her heart hammering against her ribs. The tracks surrounding the kill site were massive, easily 4 inches across, showing 4 toes and a distinct, tri-lobed heel pad. No claw marks. Feline. A mountain lion. The apex predator of the bitterroots had claimed her catch. Fear, primal, and icy, washed over her. She was sharing a very small, isolated territory with a starving, 200-pound killer. She instinctively reached for the hatchet at her belt, her knuckles turning white. She was no longer just fighting the cold, she was part of the food chain, and she was shockingly low on the hierarchy. Over the next week, the cat became a phantom tormentor. She found its massive tracks circling her cabin one morning, the prints lingering near the corner where she slept. It was smelling her, testing the perimeter. Desperation, however, is a potent antidote to fear. By day 22, Harper was starving. Her cheekbones jutted sharply beneath her soot-stained skin, and a dangerous lethargy was creeping into her muscles. She knew that if she didn't secure significant protein soon, she wouldn't have the strength to chop firewood, and the cold would simply finish the job. The twist of fate came on a Tuesday, under a brilliant, mocking blue sky. While gathering deadwood a half-mile from her camp, a chorus of ravens drew her attention to a dense thicket of spruce. Moving silently on her snowshoes, hatchet gripped tightly, she peered through the branches. There, half buried in the snow, was a mule deer doe. It had been freshly killed, its throat crushed, the hindquarters partially eaten. The cougar's tracks led away, up a steep, rocky ridge. The cat had fed and cached the rest for later, likely resting in a cave nearby. Stealing from a mountain lion's cache was suicidal. Every instinct screamed at her to back away. But her stomach roared, a physical agony that eclipsed the fear. "Hesitation kills, Harpy," her father's voice whispered in her memory. Harper moved. She didn't try to drag the carcass. It was too heavy and would leave a scent trail straight to her door. Working with frantic, terrifying speed, she used her folding knife and hatchet to butcher the remaining front shoulders and the back straps right there in the snow. Her hands were bathed in freezing blood, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She expected to hear the scream of the cat at any second. She packed nearly 30 pounds of raw, steaming meat into her duffel bag, leaving the guts and the rest of the carcass for the rightful owner. She covered her tracks as best she could and sprinted back to the cabin, collapsing through the tarp door just as the winter sun dipped below the peaks. That night, she gorged. She roasted strips of venison over the hot stones of her hearth until they sizzled, the rich fat dripping into the fire. It was a feast born of sheer audacity. She had out-scavenged an apex predator, but as she lay in the dark, listening to the wind, she kept her hatchet unsheathed, knowing the true owner of that meat was out there in the dark. December arrived with a brutality that shattered any illusion of comfort. The temperature rarely rose above 0, even at midday. The creek froze entirely, forcing Harper to melt snow in her metal bucket for drinking water, a tedious process that consumed precious firewood. The venison saved her life, providing the fat and protein necessary to keep her internal furnace burning. She smoked the remaining meat in the chimney throat, preserving it for the brutal weeks ahead. But surviving the elements was only half the battle. Surviving her own biology was another. The toll of extreme physical labor, a diet entirely lacking in vitamin C, and chronic exposure to sub-zero temperatures finally broke her immune system. It started as a dry, persistent cough on day 35. By day 37, the cough had settled deep into her chest, rattling with every breath. That evening, a violent chill seized her. Despite sitting less than 2 feet from a roaring fire, her teeth chattered so hard she chipped an incisor. Then came the fever. Harper collapsed onto her sleeping bag, her body burning while her skin felt encased in ice. Delirium crept in quickly. The walls of the tiny cabin seemed to shrink, pressing in on her. In her fevered mind, the shadows cast by the fire twisted into the faces of the people who had abandoned her. She saw her stepfather, Richard, sneering at her from the corner, holding the missing spark plug. She saw her mother, Evelyn, standing by the tarp door, her face a mask of apathetic silence, slowly turning her back and walking away into the blizzard. "Don't," Harper croaked, her throat feeling like cracked glass. "Mum, please." But the hallucination vanished, replaced by the crackle of the fire. She was entirely alone. For 2 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. The fire dwindled to embers. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. She was too weak to lift the hatchet, too weak to drag the heavy logs inside. Death was no longer a dramatic event. It was a slow, quiet, fading into the frost. During a moment of agonizing clarity, she realized she had stopped shivering. Her body was giving up the fight. Get up. The thought wasn't a hallucination. It was a hard, biological imperative. If she didn't fuel the fire and break the fever, she would die here, and nobody would ever find her body. Richard would win. Evelyn would never know the consequence of her silence. Summoning a reserve of willpower she didn't know she possessed, Harper rolled out of the sleeping bag. Her limbs felt like they were filled with lead. She dragged herself across the dirt floor, her fingers grasping blindly for the small pile of kindling she kept near the hearth. She managed to toss a few dry sticks onto the embers, blowing weakly until a small flame caught. Next, she needed medicine. She remembered a camping trip with her father to the Kootenai National Forest. He had pointed out a specific bush with reddish-brown bark growing near a river. Nature's aspirin. Harpy. Salicylic acid. It's in the inner bark. You boil it when you're burning up. Willow. The same willow she had used for her snowshoes. Harper tied her boots with trembling, uncoordinated fingers. She pushed through the tarp. The cold hit her fevered skin like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. She strapped on her crude snowshoes and stumbled the 20 yards to the frozen creek bed. Every step was a monumental effort. Her vision swam, graying at the edges. She found the cluster of willow shrubs sticking out of the snowbank. Drawing her folding knife, she frantically scraped at the reddish branches, harvesting curled ribbons of the green inner bark, stuffing them into her pockets. She barely made it back. She collapsed through the doorway, crawling to the hearth. She filled her bucket with snow, set it on the reviving fire, and dumped the bark shavings into the water. She waited in agony as the snow melted, and the water slowly came to a boil, turning a murky, bitter yellow. When it was cool enough, she drank it straight from the bucket. It tasted like dirt and old wood. But she forced every drop down her raw throat. She piled every piece of wood she had left into the firebox, crawled back into her sleeping bag, and pulled the tarp tightly over her head to trap her body heat. The night was a hallucinatory nightmare of sweating and freezing. But just before dawn, the profound, agonizing ache in her joints began to ease. The tight, burning band around her chest loosened. Harper opened her eyes. Her clothes were soaked in sweat, freezing instantly where they met the cold air. But her head was clear. The fever had broken. She lay there for a long time, watching the grey morning light filter through the gaps in the mud chinking. She was bone-thin, filthy, and exhausted. But she had fought off a mountain lion, and she had fought off death from within. She realized, with a profound, quiet certainty, that she was no longer the scared 16-year-old girl thrown out of a Ford F-150. She had been burned down to her absolute core, and what remained was unbreakable. January gripped the Bitterroot Mountains with a hostility that felt deeply personal. The days were brutally short, offering only a few hours of weak, grey light before plunging the wilderness back into a sub-zero abyss. Harper's world had shrunk to the 8-by-8-foot interior of her mud-chinked cabin, a fragile bubble of life sustained by the relentless, exhausting cycle of gathering firewood. Her recovery from the fever had left her weak, her body cannibalizing its own muscle to keep her organs functioning. But the smoked venison had been her salvation. A rich, fatty lifeline hanging in strips from the heavy pine rafters above her sleeping bag. Until the night of the phantom breach. Harper awoke to a sound that made her blood run cold, a frantic, tearing noise from directly above her head. The heavy tarp that formed the outer layer of her roof was being shredded. Dust, dried mud, and freezing pine needles cascaded onto her face. She scrambled backward, grabbing the rusted hatchet. In the dim, dying orange glow of the hearth, she saw it. A massive, dark shape had chewed through the frozen mud and branches of her roof, its wide, flat head pushing through the gap. It wasn't the cougar. It had small, rounded ears, a frosted brown muzzle, and eyes that reflected the embers like twin drops of blood. A wolverine, the glutton of the northern woods. Known to drive grizzly bears off their kills, the 30-pound weasel was a creature of pure, concentrated fury and bottomless hunger. It wasn't looking at Harper. It was locked onto the smoked venison hanging just inches from its snapping jaws. "Hey!" Harper screamed, her voice cracking. She swung the hatchet, striking the wooden rafter inches from the animal's snout. The wolverine didn't flinch. It let out a low, guttural chattering sound, lunged forward, and clamped its jaws around the thickest bundle of meat. Harper grabbed a burning piece of kindling from the firebox and thrust it upward. The singed fur smelled acrid, and the beast finally recoiled, but not before tearing down half the paracord stringer. It vanished back through the hole in the roof, dragging 10 pounds of life-saving protein out into the blizzard. Harper spent the rest of the night shivering violently, holding a heavy stone against the hole in the roof, waiting for daylight. By morning, she patched the breach with a frozen slab of river clay and a lattice of thick branches. But the damage was done. Her food supply was halved, and the psychological sanctuary of her cabin had been violated. She was no longer safe, even behind her walls. By the end of the second week of January, the last scraps of the venison were gone. The gnawing, hollow ache in her stomach returned, louder and more insistent than before. The snow was too deep for snares, and the forest animals were either hibernating or moving with a stealth she couldn't match. She had to find water that wasn't frozen solid, and she had to find food beneath it. Her father's old friend, a rugged backcountry outfitter named Thomas Hutch Hutchinson, used to take them out to Georgetown Lake in the dead of winter. "Ice is just a lid, Harpy," Hutch had told her, his breath pluming around his thick wool beard. "The pantry is still open underneath. You just gotta know how to pick the lock." Armed with her hatchet, a long, sturdy branch, and a spool of paracord, she strapped on her makeshift snowshoes and trekked a mile downstream to a spot where the narrow creek widened into a deep, slow-moving pool. The ice here was thick, opaque, and terrifyingly solid. It took 2 hours of agonizing labor to chop a hole through 8 inches of solid ice. Every strike of the hatchet sent shockwaves up her arms, jarring her teeth. When the water finally bubbled up through the crack, it was black and lifeless. She fashioned a rudimentary gorge hook, a small, sharpened piece of bone she had saved from the deer, tied in the center to the paracord. She baited it with a preserved grub she had dug out of a rotting stump near her cabin, lowering it into the freezing depths. She sat on her overturned metal bucket. The temperature was -15. The wind howled down the canyon, cutting through her layers, biting at her face and hands. She sat for 3 hours. Her toes lost feeling first, turning into heavy blocks of wood inside her boots. Then her fingers grew stiff and clumsy. Frostnip, the precursor to frostbite, was turning the tips of her ears a waxy, dead white. She was about to give up, to surrender to the cold and the hunger, when the paracord snapped taut. Harper jerked her hand back, the cord slicing into her palm. A violent thrashing erupted beneath the ice. She pulled, hand over hand, her muscles screaming against the resistance. With a final, desperate heave, she dragged the prize out onto the frozen snow. It was a massive bull trout, nearly 2 feet long, its olive-green skin shimmering with pale yellow spots. It flopped wildly on the ice. A prehistoric beast pulled from the abyss. Harper fell to her knees, laughing and sobbing simultaneously, her breath catching in her throat. She dispatched the fish quickly with the back of her hatchet. It was a victory, a massive influx of fat and calories. But as she trudged back to the cabin, the heavy fish slung over her shoulder, she realized she couldn't feel her left foot at all. The wilderness always exacted a toll. Every meal was paid for in blood, sweat, or the slow theft of body heat. February brought a deceptive calm to the Bitterroots. The relentless blizzards paused, replaced by a high-pressure system that locked the mountains in a deep, crystalline freeze. The skies were a painfully bright, cloudless blue, and the snowpack hardened into a thick crust that could bear her weight without snowshoes. Physically, Harper had adapted. The trout, supplemented by scavenged pine nuts and the inner bark of lodgepole pines, kept her alive. She was gaunt. Her clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her skin was stained with wood smoke and dirt. But she was functional. Psychologically, however, the isolation was beginning to fracture her mind. She had not heard a human voice in 90 days. The silence of the winter woods is absolute. It rings in the ears, pressing against the eardrums until the brain begins to invent sounds just to fill the void. Harper began catching herself having full-throated conversations with the rusted bowsaw. She would hear the crunch of boots on snow, whip her head around, and see nothing but the swaying pines. She heard Evelyn crying in the wind. She heard Richard's heavy, angry footfalls echoing off the canyon walls. To anchor her sanity, she established routines. She mapped her territory, marking a 1 mile perimeter around her cabin with slashes on tree trunks. On a bitterly cold Tuesday, while checking the perimeter near the southern ridge, her heart stopped. There, stamped clearly into the frozen crust of the snow, was a line of tracks. They were not the trilobed prints of a cougar, nor the frantic bounds of a hare. They were the deep, mechanical treads of a modern winter boot, size 11 or 12. Harper dropped into a crouch, her hand instinctively flying to the hatchet at her belt. Panic, hot and metallic, flooded her system. The tracks were fresh, the edges sharp and unweathered by the wind. They stumbled erratically, dragging on the right side, weaving through the trees before disappearing over the ridge toward her ravine. Richard. It was her first thought. He had finally felt guilty, or the sheriff had forced him to look. But Richard was a coward. He wouldn't hike into the backcountry in sub-zero temperatures. Someone else was out here. And they were heading straight for her cabin. Harper ran. She moved with the silent, practiced grace of a hunted animal, darting from tree to tree until her cabin came into view. The area was untouched. The intruder hadn't arrived yet. Paranoia completely consumed her. She spent the afternoon rigging crude alarms, stretching lengths of spare paracord across the natural entry points to the ravine, tying them to heavy, dry branches that would snap loudly if tripped. She brought all her chopped wood inside, barricaded the tarp door with her metal bucket and several heavy rocks, and sat in the dark, the fire reduced to a barely glowing ember. The storm hit at midnight. The clear skies vanished, replaced by a vicious, swirling whiteout that dropped visibility to zero. The wind screamed like a tortured animal. Over the roar of the blizzard, Harper heard it. Crack. Clatter. One of her tripwires, set 50 yards up the creek, had snapped. Harper stood up, her entire body rigid. She gripped the hatchet in her right hand and her folding knife in her left. She waited, her eyes locked on the heavy tarp door, her breath shallow and silent. 5 minutes passed. Then, a heavy thud against the outer log wall, a scraping sound, and then, a voice. It wasn't a shout. It was a pathetic, gurgling moan, barely audible over the wind. Help. Please. Harper froze her. The instinct to protect her sanctuary warred violently with the ingrained human impulse to aid the dying. If she opened the door, she let the freezing wind in. If this was a trick, she was dead. But the voice sounded impossibly weak. She shoved the rocks aside, pulled back the tarp, and raised her hatchet. A figure collapsed inward, falling face first onto the dirt floor of the cabin, bringing a mountain of snow with them. It was a man, encased in a high-end, bright blue Gore-Tex mountaineering suit that was ripped to shreds on the right side. He was wearing one boot. The other foot was wrapped in a bloody, frozen rag. Harper kicked his legs inside, shoved the tarp back into place, and barricaded it. She turned to the intruder. He was unconscious, his face deathly pale, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. Ice clung to his eyebrows and beard. He was in the terminal stages of hypothermia. His body had stopped shivering, a sign that his core temperature had dropped to fatal levels. Harper dragged him closer to the hearth. She tore at his frozen jacket zipper, peeling the wet layers off his chest. His name tag, stitched into his base layer, read David Gallagher. She piled every piece of wood she had onto the embers, blowing frantically until a massive fire roared in the stone firebox. The tiny cabin quickly heated to 80 degrees, but ambient heat wasn't enough to save a man this far gone. She had to make a choice. The 0-degree sleeping bag was her only guarantee of survival if the fire went out. Without hesitation, she unzipped it, shoved the freezing, unconscious man inside, and packed her own spare wool sweaters around him. She heated water in her bucket, soaked a piece of cloth, and placed it against his neck, targeting the carotid artery to warm the blood flowing to his brain. For 10 hours, she tended to him, sitting against the log wall, her hatchet resting on her knee, just in case. When David Gallagher finally opened his eyes, the blizzard had passed. He stared up at the mud-packed ceiling, then turned his head to see the feral, soot-stained 16-year-old girl watching him from the shadows. "Am I dead?" he whispered, his voice rasping. "Harper." "No," Harper said, her voice gravelly from disuse, sounding strange even to her own ears. "But you're in my house, and you need to tell me who you are." She was no longer the discarded runaway. She was the master of her environment, the lord of the ravine, and she had just pulled a man back from the edge of the abyss. Waking up to the ragged, uneven breathing of a stranger in her sanctuary was violently jarring. For over 3 months, Harper's reality had been dictated by an absolute, crushing solitude. The only sounds she had known were the crackle of her own fire, the howling of the bitterroot winds, and the quiet, persistent voice of her own survival instincts. Now, the cramped 8 by 8 foot cabin felt suffocatingly small, the air thick with the metallic tang of sweat and the terrifying scent of encroaching sickness. David Gallagher did not wake up fully for another 24 hours. When the fever of severe hypothermia finally broke, it left him weak, intensely disoriented, and racked with violent, uncontrollable tremors. Harper sat cross-legged on the dirt floor across the stone hearth, feeding the fire with meticulous, measured care. Her father's rusted hatchet rested easily across her knees, her hand resting near the handle. She watched him with the wary, unblinking gaze of a feral cat whose den had been invaded. "Water," David rasped. The word was barely a vibration in his dry throat. His eyes darted around the primitive, soot-stained walls of the cabin. He looked at the clay-packed chimney, the rough-hewn log joints, the heavy pine rafters, and finally at the gaunt, filthy teenager watching him from the shadows. "Where? Whose camp is this?" "Mine," Harper said simply. Her voice was gravelled from disuse, sounding entirely alien to her. She pushed her dented, soot-blackened metal bucket toward him across the dirt. It was filled with lukewarm, melted snow. David dragged himself up onto his elbows, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his frozen limbs. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his frost-crusted beard. Over the next few days, the story of his arrival unspooled in halting, exhausted fragments between long bouts of sleep. He was 34, a backcountry hydrologist contracted by the state of Montana to measure deep mountain snowpack for spring flood predictions. A sudden, localized whiteout had separated him from his partner near the upper ridges. He had lost his bearing, snapped his compass during a brutal fall down a rocky scree, and wandered blindly for 2 days before his dying senses caught the faint, impossible smell of wood smoke carrying on the wind. "You built this?" David asked on the 3rd day, pulling himself up to lean heavily against the log wall. He gestured to the heavy roof beams and the perfectly drawing chimney that was currently saving his life. "A girl your age, out here alone." "I had a saw," Harper replied, as if a rusted piece of metal fully explained the impossible mathematics of her survival. But David's awe was rapidly overshadowed by a grim, terrifying reality. As feelings slowly returned to his extremities, the agonizing pain of the initial thaw faded into something much worse. A heavy, dead numbness. He pulled back the bloody rag Harper had wrapped around his right foot. Harper leaned forward, her breath catching. The flesh of his toes and the upper bridge of his foot was a horrifying landscape of mottled purple and pitch black. It was completely cold to the touch. Severe, 4th-degree frostbite. The tissue was dead, and the sickly sweet, rotting odor of early gangrene was already beginning to permeate the small cabin. "I have a medkit in my pack," David muttered, his face draining of all color as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Left exterior pocket. I couldn't open the zippers. My hands were too frozen." Harper retrieved his shredded, high-end, bright blue Gore-Tex pack from the corner. Inside, beneath emergency rations that had been crushed into powder, she found treasures that belonged to another universe entirely. heavy-duty, sterile bandages, a small bottle of iodine, surgical scissors, a tube of lidocaine cream, and a sealed blister pack of broad-spectrum antibiotics. In a world without doctors, the 16-year-old runaway had to become a reluctant surgeon. Following David's pained, breathless instructions, Harper set to work. She boiled a fresh bucket of snow, utilizing the precious heat of the fire. She sterilized her folding knife and his surgical scissors in the rolling water, then scrubbed her own scarred, blistered hands with the iodine until they stained a dark, rusty orange. "You have to cut away the black tissue, Harper," David told her, his voice trembling as he bit down hard on a piece of split pine kindling. "If you don't debride the dead flesh, the infection will hit my bloodstream. I'll go septic in 2 days." Harper hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She had skinned snowshoe hares. She had butchered a stolen mule deer in the snow while an apex predator lurked nearby. Blood no longer frightened her, but cutting into a living, breathing human being tested the very limits of her hardened resolve. She applied the lidocaine, though they both knew it would do little for the deeper nerve endings that were waking up in agony. Then, with a chilling, detached efficiency born of pure necessity, she began to cut. The cabin filled with David's muffled, agonizing groans. He thrashed weakly against the dirt floor, but Harper held his ankle down with her knee, her expression entirely unreadable. She snipped away the necrotic flesh, clearing the rotting tissue until she hit healthy, bleeding margins. She flushed the horrific wounds with iodine, coated them in antibiotic ointment, and wrapped the foot tightly in thick white gauze. When it was over, Harper tossed the bloody scraps of flesh into the fire, watching them sizzle and burn. David lay exhausted, his chest heaving, tears streaming openly down his soot-stained face. Sharing her space meant sharing her rapidly dwindling resources. The massive bull trout she had pulled from the ice weeks ago was a distant memory. To keep them both alive, they survived on a meager, bitter broth of boiled pine bark, the few remaining grubs she had hoarded, and the dried dandelion roots she had preserved in the chimney throat. Hunger was no longer a sharp, stabbing pain. It was a hollow, echoing cavern inside their chests that made their heads swim and their limbs feel like lead. Yet, despite the starvation, the lingering smell of infection, and the crushing cold outside, a strange, quiet bond formed between them in the glow of the hearth. David didn't talk down to her. He didn't ask her why she was out here, nor did he press for details about her past. He recognized the hard, defensive shell. She wore a shell necessary for surviving the cruelty of the world, and he respected it. Instead, to keep their minds from fracturing in the dark, he talked. He taught her about the topography of the Bitterroots, about the migration patterns of elk herds, and about the complex thermal mechanics of the spring thaw that was slowly approaching. In return, Harper showed him her crude willow branch snowshoes and explained the trial and error process of engineering the smoke shelf in her stone hearth. She explained how to read the moss to find north, a trick her late father had taught her. "You're not just surviving, Harper," David said one evening. The firelight flickered across his pale, drawn face as he watched her meticulously sharpen her hatchet with a smooth river stone. "You adapted to this environment. Most grown men with advanced military training would have died in this ravine back in November. I would have died 3 days ago if you hadn't opened that door. People die because they panic," Harper said, her voice flat, her eyes never leaving the blade of the hatchet, "or because they sit around and wait for someone else to fix their problems. Nobody is coming to fix this. Someone is," David corrected gently, pulling his heavy jacket tighter around his emaciated frame. "My partner made it back to the rally point. The moment this high-pressure system breaks and the skies clear, search and rescue will be flying grid patterns over these ridges. We just have to stay alive until they see your smoke." Harper didn't reply. She tested the edge of the hatchet with her thumb, feeling the sharp, deadly bite of the steel. She wanted to believe him, But her entire life had taught her that hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. The bitter roots were demanding their final toll. And she knew the hardest part of winter wasn't the freezing dark, it was the treacherous, violent thaw. March arrived not with a gentle warming, but with a violent structural shift. The deep freeze cracked. The temperature swung wildly, rising above freezing during the day and plummeting at night. The snowpack grew heavy, wet, and unstable. The silent woods were suddenly filled with the terrifying, artillery-like cracks of distant avalanches and the constant, rushing roar of the creek breaking through its icy armor. The rising water became an immediate threat. The sluggish stream swelled into a violent, muddy torrent, creeping up the embankment toward the cabin. Harper and a crippled David spent 2 agonizing days digging a diversion trench with pieces of wood and her metal bucket, redirecting the overflow away from her foundation. The physical exertion burned the last of their reserves. By mid-March, they were starving. David's foot was heavily bandaged, and he could barely stand. Harper's vision blurred when she stood up too fast, and her hands shook constantly. She had to hunt. The snares were useless in the slush. "I'm going to the high ridge," Harper announced, wrapping her feet in fresh strips of blanket before pulling on her damp boots. "The deer will be moving up to the southern slopes where the snow is melting to find moss." "It's too dangerous, Harper," David warned, his voice weak. "The snow bridges are collapsing, and the predators will be hunting the exact same slopes. If I don't go, we starve in our sleep by Tuesday," she replied. She took his emergency flare gun, a heavy, plastic pistol loaded with a single magnesium shell, and tucked it into her belt next to her hatchet. The climb was a nightmare. She waded through waist-deep, wet slush, her muscles screaming. When she finally reached the southern ridgeline, the wind hit her, carrying the sharp, distinct scent of wet fur and old blood. She froze. 50 yards away, standing on a rocky outcropping, was the mountain lion. It was massive, its winter coat ragged and matted. Its ribs showed clearly against its flanks. It was a starving, desperate, apex predator. And it was looking right at her. Harper didn't run. Running triggered the prey drive. She stood her ground, her hand slowly moving to the handle of the hatchet. The cougar let out a low, vibrating hiss that rattled in Harper's chest. It dropped low to the ground, its powerful shoulder blades rising, and began to stalk forward. Its golden eyes locked on her face. Hesitation kills. Harper drew the flare gun. Her hands were shaking violently from exhaustion, but her focus narrowed to a diamond point. She waited. 40 yards. 30 yards. The cat's muscles tensed for the final, lethal sprint. Harper raised the orange plastic pistol, aimed slightly ahead of the cat's path, and pulled the trigger. The kickback bruised her palm. A blinding, sizzling streak of red phosphorus erupted from the barrel, tearing through the air and impacting the rocky ground just 10 feet in front of the cougar. The explosion of blinding red light and thick, sulphurous smoke was accompanied by a deafening hiss. The mountain lion shrieked a terrifying, almost human sound of absolute panic. Its momentum carried it forward, but it scrambled wildly sideways, tumbling over the snowbank to avoid the unnatural fire. It scrambled to its feet, threw one last terrified glance at the girl wreathed in red smoke, and bolted into the deep timber. Harper collapsed onto the wet snow, her chest heaving, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She lay there for 10 minutes, waiting for the adrenaline to recede. She had no meat. The hunt was a failure. But as she dragged herself back to the ravine, empty-handed and exhausted, a different sound pierced the heavy spring air. It wasn't the roar of the creek, nor the wind in the pines. It was a mechanical, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in her teeth. She burst through the tree line above the cabin. Hovering 100 feet above the narrow gorge was a yellow and black Bell 412 helicopter. It was circling the thick, grey column of smoke rising perfectly from her clay chimney. David had dragged himself out of the tarp door, waving his bright blue jacket weakly in the air. Harper stood on the ridge, watching the metal machine lower a rescue basket toward her home. A profound, crushing wave of grief washed over her. The battle was over. The cabin, her fortress of mud and wood and bone, had served its purpose. It had kept her alive. It had made her lethal. It had made her untouchable. She walked slowly down the embankment. David grabbed her arm as the deafening downwash of the rotors whipped the tarp door open. "You did it, Harper!" he shouted over the noise, tears freezing on his cheeks. "You kept us alive." She looked at her mud-caked hands, at the rusted hatchet strapped to her belt, and then up at the hovering chopper. She was going back to a world of group homes, of social workers, of Richard and Evelyn. But as the rescue basket touched the ground, she realized something fundamental had changed. They couldn't cage her anymore. She knew how to build a fire in the dark. Civilization did not know what to do with a girl who had conquered the Bitterroots. When the rescue chopper touched down in Missoula, Harper Delaney was a feral anomaly, a 16-year-old who had survived negative 20-degree blizzards, performed field surgery, and outlasted apex predators. The subsequent media frenzy was deafening, but Harper remained silent, refusing to let her trauma become their entertainment. Richard Caldwell was arrested for reckless endangerment and child abandonment, leaving Evelyn alone in a house built on silence. Harper, legally emancipated with the relentless legal backing of David Gallagher, refused to return to the system. She took a job with the Forestry Service, living on the edges of the wild she had tamed. Deep in that unnamed ravine, the 8x8 cabin still stands, slowly returning to the earth, a silent monument to the unyielding truth that sometimes survival requires letting the old version of yourself freeze to death.